Hiro is a star in the ECD world. May not need much introduction to some of us, but for those of us who still don't know him, he is actually a Courtney Sale Ross Professor of Globalization and Education, a university professor in New York University. He conducts research on the effects of programs and policies related to early childhood development, immigration and poverty on child and youth development. He co-directs the NYU Global Ties for Children Center, directed the research and evaluation of the MacArthur 100 and Change partnership between Sesame Workshop, we heard from them this morning as well, and the International Rescue Committee to provide ECD programming to Syrian refugees and host communities in the Middle East. The Lego Foundation funded Play to Learn initiative, the Rohingya in Bangladesh, Syrian refugees in the Middle East, Venezuelan refugees in Colombia, member of the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel of the FCDO, the World Bank, UNICEF, and USAID, as well as US National Board of Education Sciences.
Some of the key findings really of at least 10 years and often many more decades of work on the part of those who were there, but I'm emphasizing the 10 years because of the Early Childhood Peace Consortium, which I feel lucky to be a member of, and I thank the leadership of the ECPC, the leadership and commitment of UNICEF to ECD globally, to the other hosts, ACHEV, the permanent missions of Ireland, Colombia, and Chile. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, really briefly, what does some of the evidence say that was really beautifully summarized this morning by Sasha Hein, Josh Fader, and many others, and has been the focus of the Early Childhood Research Consortium's link between evidence and policy, but then moved to what I think might be some pathways and lessons about achieving joint peace building and early childhood development at national scale, which is really what our goal is here today and into the future. So first of all, I would say we have a really powerful rationale for this link between ECD and peace building, I returned to a very important presentation that some of us were present at, which was the very last meeting of the Open Working Group for the Global Goals in 2014. And so ECD was not on the agenda, and in fact, for many in the Open Working Group, I was amazed to realize that the arguments that we find familiar, which is the power of what the basic neuroscience tells us, what the economics of early childhood development tells us, was not familiar to many of the members of the Open Working Group, who after all come from many, many different technical areas and are leaders in their country, but are not necessarily specialists in child development or have heard the basic arguments. And so at that point, the power of ECD for societal development and the argument which we made, which is that without the next generation to actually lead our planet towards a more sustainable future, all of the other goals are threatened. There is no existence of the other 16 goals without investing in human development from birth across the lifespan. And when I talk about early childhood development, I'm actually also including a much more of a lifespan perspective. So we think of the role of youth, for example. But I think what some of the really wonderful new reviews that were presented this morning show us that early childhood development programs with intentional curricular aspects and high quality reduce violence in the home, promote social emotional learning, which is the developmental foundation of peace, can contribute to reducing community level violence and increasing social cohesion. And I think what I want to linger on is this notion of the societal level. And at the societal level, ECD can be integrated with initiatives like peace building and reconciliation kinds of initiatives. And so I do recommend the new book on foundations of peace. But I want to turn to what are the pathways at the national level that we might build on from this morning's evidence with an example or two each. And the first will be building peace building into national ECD policy frameworks. The second is moving beyond conflict and crisis settings in the humanitarian sector so that the humanitarian sector engages with national governments. And then the third is peace building and social cohesion as a challenge to vulnerability and disadvantaged focused protection policies, how they can actually enrich protection policies in a fundamental way. So first, building peace building into national ECD policy frameworks. The book by Josh Fader, Siobhan Fitzpatrick, and Margalit Ziv makes a very powerful case that ECD can be integrated with reconciliation strategies in conflict and post-conflict societies. But I also think the converse is true, which is that peace building can be incorporated into national ECD policy frameworks. So what is the status, the global status of national multi-sectoral ECD policy frameworks? I can refer you all to a great article by Emily Vargas-Barón, who many of you know as a leader in inclusive and participatory ECD policy development. Her article from last year sums up the state of the field of multi-sectoral ECD policies globally just prior to COVID. At that point, 76 countries, as of the beginning of COVID, and I have to unfortunately say we're not that much further along right now, partly due to what COVID has wrought on the politically, financially, and in tandem with a lot of other climate change and armed conflict disasters. 53% of low-income countries at that point had multi-sectoral ECD policies, 55% of lower middle-income countries, 38% of upper middle-income countries, and only 14% of high-income countries. I thought that was actually super interesting, is that the high-income countries are doing the worst, and we're sitting in one that is doing, is one of those 86% that does not have an integrated or multi-sectoral ECD policy. Another really important finding by Emily and her colleagues are that more inclusive and participatory policy planning processes result in better implementation of ECD policies. That is a direct lesson for this link between peace building and ECD, which is more inclusive and participatory processes at the national level lead to better implementation of ECD policies. I want to give an exciting example from Colombia that the Deputy Ambassador did not mention today, but she mentioned the larger context, which is that Colombia does have now national legislation dating back 2 years prohibiting all forms of violence against children, including corporal punishment. And research by Jorge Cortes, who is a doctoral candidate. For all of you who are students, this is just a vision of what you can do as a student. So his research was one of the fundamental bases in Colombia, presenting Colombian research showing the harms that corporal punishment causes to children that was cited in the national legislation. He has also contributed as a researcher to the National Implementation Strategy, which is called the National Strategy and Pedagogy to Prevent Corporal Punishment and Cruel, Humiliating, and Degrading Treatment of Children. It includes concrete actions by the national ECD agencies, and I think is a great example of how building violence prevention intentionally into a national ECD policy framework can move into the implementation phase. The second is moving the humanitarian sector beyond crisis and conflict into work with national governments. And here I wanted to just accentuate one part of this initiative that Sherry Weston from Sesame Workshop talked about, which is Ahlan Simsim, which is an initiative to support ECD programming amongst Syrian refugee and host communities in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. The part of that project that I'm the most proud of, there's many things to be proud of, the Ahlan Simsim TV show, which by the way has a theme song that will just stick in your ear for days and days if you Google Ahlan Simsim and watch any episode. The episodes start with this earworm of a theme song. Maybe we can ask for it later, the karaoke section of today's session. But that initiative intentionally had a full-time person at the IRC in Amman to work with governments. And that was actually new for the International Rescue Committee, it resulted in partnerships with 8 to 10 ministries of education. And so the curricular materials have been taken up by the Ministry of Social Affairs in Lebanon around their childcare centers, the Jordan's Ministry of Health and their midwives well-being child visits, and by the Ministry of Education in Iraq through a school readiness program. So I think those kinds of partnerships are another clue that the humanitarian sector can step out of its kind of formal remit of kind of settings described as humanitarian and coordinated by UNHCR to actually be sustainable and scale up with national government work. Finally, peace building and social cohesion as a challenge to the crisis of human connection. We are living in a crisis situation worldwide right now, rising rates of mental health problems, suicide, isolation, and violence in high and low and middle income countries alike. And so I want to bring in some of the developmental work of a colleague of mine, Niobe Wei, who has studied this in multiple countries. She finds that the capacity for intimate friendships unfortunately declines during adolescence as society values individual achievement and a me culture over a we culture. That social media unfortunately can make this worse, even though it can also provide vital human connections in other contexts. And the toxic intersections of masculinity, nationalism, and exclusion, which we are seeing in far too many countries around the world. So some of the solutions I think are both program and national level. At the program level, I'm engaged with Professor Wei in some work that addresses missing gaps in social emotional learning. We believe that there are fundamental skills in relating to others which involve interpersonal curiosity, asking questions, asking follow-up questions, and achieving deeper relationship that all 4- and 5-year-old kids have. Think of all the questions, the constant questions that a 5-year-old has, and the wise questions they have, and why we don't hear as many from adolescents. And in fact, in Niobe's work, longitudinally following boys and girls over adolescence, they speak tragically of friendships thinning out, disappearing, not having those conversations, not being able to express undying love for your best friend. And so a intervention that really targets these, that has been now implemented in multiple countries, involves transformative listening skills. We train middle school adolescents at the age of 11 or 12 to ask deep, qualitative, like the top-level qualitative, in-depth research questions in a way that an ethnographer would ask the follow-up questions. And this deepens their friendships and their sense of relation. And we think that this is really important to target youth development for this and build on early childhood skills. And solutions at the national level include bringing human connection and social cohesion into national policy frameworks. And here I think I refer you to all of the ECPC publications, the new book. There are very many exciting examples. I can say that right this minute, the state of California is considering becoming the first state in the United States to deliver statewide initiatives on human connection to address the crisis of connection, isolation, loneliness, and violence. But a variety of national policy pathways, and we heard a lot of exciting pathways from Ireland and Colombia today, including redirecting policies from solely socioeconomic approaches to social protection to social relationships and relational intelligence. And so this is extraordinarily important to build relational links that are the basis of social cohesion into employment programs, community development policies, be integrative towards refugees, asylees, as Colombia has been, and you can kind of contrast that with other countries like Bangladesh and the variation that different refugee and asylee populations experience. Reframing fear of crime to promoting safety and inclusion and building community social fabric as an approach to prevent violence. Many of the efforts to bring indigenous rights and anti-racism into early childhood development where it's not always incorporated into national policies, and beyond providing equity for girls and women, investing in fatherhood and men as a pathway to peace, which Kyle Pruitt has done so much work on, that Eduardo, who's here somewhere, is always reminding us at UNICEF. And then finally, I think research has to track the implementation of these kinds of social cohesion policies. We need to not just develop programs to build interrelationships and at the family or home or center level, as ECD typically does, but we need to track in national data sets when social cohesion policies go to scale, when there is greater understanding across groups that are often at war or in conflict. We need to use the mixed data set. We need to use the DHS data sets. We need to actually apply a policy analysis framework in addition to the kinds of program evaluations that we heard about this morning. And only through those steps, I think, can we realize the potential of peace building in ECD systems and ECD systems in peace building. Thanks very much.